Greetings again from just outside Athens, Georgia. My name is Jill Tolbert, and I am Joel's wife. I've met several of you when I have visited I guess I was there in December and then again in February a couple of times, but I have not been back. Travel has been limited, obviously, and so I miss being there. I'm looking forward to being with you. The movers come tomorrow, load up the van, and I should be up there by the end of next week. So by next Sunday, I will be a resident of Chestertown. I went around the house to try to find a really appealing location to do this, and I couldn't find anything that wasn't covered with boxes. So I have my bookshelf back there, but it's empty because the boxes are packed. If you look on the lower bookshelves, you can see all of my teaching materials and my printer and such. This is where I do my teaching every day. But I want to share with you today a book that I would say I'm reading it, but that's not really true. I have read it. The book is World Changing 101, Challenging the Myth of Powerlessness, Challenging the Myth of Powerlessness by David Lamotte. I have read this book. I read it in 2014 when it was originally published, and I am listening to it again on audiobook as I go on my walks. So it's not really a lie to say that I have read it. I am reading it. I'm not currently reading it. I'm currently listening to it. At any rate, David Lamotte is a friend of ours. He is a folk musician who began his career outside of Asheville, North Carolina. He's the son of a Presbyterian pastor, so he's what some of us call Presby famous. David would occasionally take the stage in Montreat, North Carolina for summer conferences, in addition to stages and church sanctuaries across the Southeast. That's how we got to know him. In 2008, after his marriage and the birth of their son Mason, David was awarded a Rotary World Peace Fellowship to study peace and conflict resolution in Australia. So he and his wife Deanna and their young son Mason packed everything up and moved across the ocean and went to live in Australia for a few years. He has since come back and now keeps himself busy with speaking engagements, concerts, and working with PEG Partners, the nonprofit organization that he and his wife Deanna founded shortly after their honeymoon there in Guatemala. It is with this organization that Joel and I traveled to Guatemala last summer with David and about 12 or 13 other people to learn more about the country and the work that PEG Partners does there. We are supporters of this work, and we hope to go back to Guatemala at some point, maybe even longer term, and encourage you to check into the work that they do. And if you're looking for ways that you can help outside of this country, consider supporting PEG Partners. David begins his book quoting the poet Mary Oliver. Oliver, in one of her poems, says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And with that, David invites us into a conversation about world changing. He writes later in chapter 1, "The problems we face as individuals, as families, as communities, as nations, and as a planet are significant, large, and insidious. It is sometimes hard to imagine how anyone could have much of an impact, much less how I could." Now, he wrote this in 2014, and now 2020, 6 years later, I would agree. I would imagine you would agree that the world is not any better, and it might even be worse. With that in mind, he wanted to lay out explicitly his own agenda for writing this book. He says, "I want my 5-year-old son," Mason is now 11, and Mason actually went to Guatemala with us when we went last summer. "But I want my son Mason and the rest of his generation to grow up in a world that is growing and healing rather than one that is tearing itself apart socially, politically, and physically." Then in chapter 2, David does what I think is really important. He lays out some central terms that are key in this book, and he doesn't want to necessarily argue that his definition is the right definition of these terms, but he does want to give you an outline of what he means when he uses the terms so that we can be on the same page as we attempt to understand his writing going forward. I'm not going to talk about all of the terms, but I do want to lift up a few of them because I think they're key. First thing he talks about is hope. He says, "Hope is the conscious decision to live toward the world you would like to see, to take action to move closer to a better way, regardless of your chances of achieving your goal. Hope begins with an honest assessment of a given situation, but then it grows into a conscious choice to lend your own energy to move that situation into a better direction. So that's what he means by hope. Hope, he says, is both an active choice as well as a choice to be active. The next words he brings up, the next word he wants to define and be clear on his definition of is activism. He says activism is not an angry protest. We think of activism oftentimes as being a protest, but activism in his mind is not a protest. Activism is merely the opposite of passivism. Activism is taking action, any action, to address a problem that exists outside yourself. So that's an important definition to keep in mind as well. Then he talks about anger and hatred. Anger is an emotion, and anger is an emotion that might arise out of a situation of injustice. So anger in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Anger can be a powerful motivator for constructive action, at least for a little while. But David is aware that over time, anger, unaddressed anger, can calcify into hatred. And hatred involves wishing harm on someone else. That is the difference between being angry with someone and hating someone. Hating really wishes harm on someone else. Then he moves on to talk about aid and justice. And I love the story that he tells. It's a common story. You've probably heard it. I've heard it several times, but it's a story, and I don't know where it came from. He's not sure where it came from. It's a well-known story, but a woman is taking a walk down beside a river, and she looks up in the river, and there's a baby floating down the river crying, a live baby crying. And so she rushes in, grabs the baby out of the river, pulls it to the side, and starts to take care of it. And then she looks up and she sees another baby, and there's another baby coming down the river. And so she runs in the river and gets this other baby, and more people come along and help, and they start pulling baby after baby after baby out of the river. And then at some point, they had almost started to feel like they were catching up, pulling baby after baby out of the river. And an older woman walked nearby, looked around with a stern impression, threw her head back, and shouted for everyone to stop and be quiet. So they all did, kind of wondering what she was about. And the woman says firmly but quietly, "Don't you think it's time we went upstream to see who is throwing the babies in the river in the first place?" And that story is a fictitious story, but it really does give a helpful illustration of the difference between aid work and justice work. Aid work is about meeting people's needs. Justice work is about challenging the systems that made them needy in the first place. And some people are called to aid work, and some people are called more to justice work. But there's a difference. There's a distinct difference between the two. And he thinks it's really important to lay out that difference. The next terms that he addresses are peace and placidity. He quotes Senator John Lewis, one of the best things Georgia has given us, by writing, peace is not the absence of conflict, Lewis has said. Conflict is often necessary on the way to justice. David writes, sometimes peacemaking involves revealing a conflict that is woven into a situation in order to bring about change so that we can deal with it. Those who attempt to be peacemakers may look like they are actually stirring up trouble. They can look like they are creating tension. But the trouble, David writes, is already there. In order to heal the trouble, we have to give it light and air. And when we can bring up the tension, the trouble, up into the light, giving it light and air, then we can truly begin to heal it. And then in chapter 3, after he lays out his terms, so he says, now what can we do? What is it that we can do? He writes, as a culture, we have come to a place where we equate cynicism with realism and hope with naivete. But that is unrealistic. reality sometimes is hopeful, he writes, and we need to not defeat ourselves before we start. It's not naive to think we can change the world, but rather it's naive to think that we can be in the world and not change it in some way. Everything we do, every little thing we do changes the world, whether we like it or not. So he ends chapter 3 with the question, what changes will we then work to make, and how will we go about making those changes? Then in chapter 4, he lays out the narratives that he is going to share with us throughout the next several chapters. And he says at the end of chapter 4, you may be called to make great sacrifices for the things you believe in, or you may not. But don't fall into the illusion that what you are doing today has to be grand or heroic in order to matter. Don't discount the value of a beginning. And he calls us to just begin. The book goes on to walk through several different narratives of change, situations of change that he has seen throughout his years of music and peacemaking and speaking, ending with a story of how the nonprofit Peg Partners was founded in Guatemala. And then finally, in part 3, he asks the question, so what is yours to do? And he provides some questions and some guidance for those who are ready to take the next step towards peace and justice for all of God's good creation. I really would commend this book to you, World Changing 101, Challenging the Myth of Powerlessness. When I first read it, before I actually read it, I thought, I really don't have the energy for this because I'm going to feel too convicted, and it's going to give me one more thing that I feel like I need to do. But what it has helped me do is to realize how the things that I do with my life, how with my teaching, with my speaking, and even with my art, how I am working in my own way to work for peace and justice. So I have been able to take this frame that David lays out and imagine my life in that frame. So it has not made me exhausted, but it has rather energized me towards doing the work that I do with more intention and with more conviction that it is the work that I'm called to do, and it is the work that I'm called to do in this time and in this place. And it is what I'm doing with my one wild and precious life. So I encourage you to look into this book. David also is a great singer-songwriter, and much of what he talks about in the book, those principles are lifted up in his songs. He's got several CDs, 11 or 12 by now. They're all available online. You can check them out at davidlamotte.com. You will often find us listening to them and using them in some way in worship settings or education settings. I use them in my pottery studio. One of his songs was even the motivating factor behind a tattoo that I recently got. It's a candle on my wrist, and he has a song called Just One Candle. And the lyric that I really love is, all the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light of just one candle. I think that's Francis of Assisi, but I like to give David credit for it. But I challenge you, I encourage you, I commend his books and his music to you. And I look forward to being up there with you, and maybe we can share some of these experiences and some of these questions and conversations together. Happy Thursday, happy weekend ahead, and I will see you in less than 10 days at this point. Thanks.